CEO mistook little garbage picker for thief, only to discover she was his daughter who. A CEO mistakes a little garbage picker for a thief, right outside a luxury hotel, in front of cameras and strangers. Security drags the scared black girl away as he turns his back, thinking the problem is solved. But then, she collapses, and a nurse comes running, screaming his name. At the hospital, the truth begins to crack open. The girl wasn't stealing. She was collecting trash to help pay for her mother's dialysis. Then comes the whisper that stops him cold. "Mommy says you're my daddy, but you don't know yet." A faded bracelet, a past he thought was buried, and a shocking discovery that proves he was lied to, and his own child was erased from his life. Now he faces an impossible choice: protect his image, or expose a truth that could destroy everything he built. Will he walk away again, or finally fight for the daughter who never stopped believing? He'd come back? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The morning sun glinted off the polished glass facade of the Grand Ashford Hotel, casting a golden glow across the bustling downtown street. Caleb Hartwell adjusted his Italian silk tie, a practiced smile already settling onto his clean-shaven face. At 32, he'd mastered the art of commanding attention, and today was no exception. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, each dark hair precisely in place. Camera crews had begun setting up their equipment, their lenses aimed at the hotel's grand entrance. This merger announcement would cement Hartwell Tech's position as an industry leader. Caleb could practically taste the victory. "Mr. Hartwell?" A reporter called out, testing her microphone. "Over here." He raised his hand in acknowledgement, but his eyes caught movement near his parked Tesla. A small figure moved between the vehicles lining the curb, hands reaching toward the ground. The sight made him frown. Naomi Brooks kept her head down as she worked, her worn sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk. Her small fingers, rough from collecting bottles and cans, trembled as she reached for another empty container. The morning had been slow, only 3 bottles so far, not enough for even a small meal. Her stomach cramped, a familiar ache she tried to ignore. She wore her cleanest outfit, a faded purple t-shirt and jeans that were a little too short, but still felt out of place among the shiny cars and important-looking people. The hotel's doorman had already shooed her away twice, but she'd returned. She had to. Mom needed medicine. Caleb strode toward his car, rehearsing opening lines in his head. A flash of movement caught his eye. His rear door wasn't fully closed. Something seemed off about his leather portfolio on the back seat. His chest tightened. "Hey!" His voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" Naomi jumped, a plastic bottle clattering from her hands. She looked up at the tall man in the fancy suit, her heart racing. I'm just collecting bottles, sir." But Caleb wasn't listening. His face had darkened into a thundercloud of anger. "Security!" he barked, pointing at Naomi. "This girl was trying to break into my car." The crowd of reporters swiveled their cameras, hungry for unexpected drama. 2 security guards rushed forward, their heavy footsteps echoing on the pavement. "No, please." Naomi's voice wavered, barely above a whisper. "I didn't touch your car. I promise. I only pick up trash." She held up her small collection bag as proof, but her hands were shaking so badly that a bottle fell out. Caleb's lip curled. "I saw you near my door. My portfolio's been moved." He turned to the approaching guards. "Check her bag." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I wouldn't steal. My mama taught me better than that." The security guards flanked her, their shadows falling across her small frame. One reached for her bag, while the other took her arm. The plastic bag crinkled as they searched it, revealing nothing but a few bottles and cans. "Sir," one guard started, "there's nothing here, but I know what I saw." Caleb cut him off, his voice sharp with authority. The cameras were rolling now, and he couldn't back down. "Remove her from the premises, and make sure she doesn't come back." The morning crowd had grown silent, watching the scene unfold. Business people clutched their coffee cups, witnesses to the public humiliation of a child. The sun beat down mercilessly, highlighting every detail: the holes in Naomi's sneakers, the pristine shine of Caleb's shoes, the tears she refused to let fall. As the guards led her away, Naomi's shoulders remained straight, her head held high despite the burning shame in her cheeks. She didn't struggle or protest. Her mama had taught her dignity too. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the click of cameras and the scuff of shoes on pavement, as the small girl was escorted away from the gleaming hotel, away from the important man who had mistaken her desperation for dishonesty, away from a morning that had started with hope and ended in humiliation. The chaos erupted without warning. A woman in blue scrubs burst through the hotel's revolving doors, her white sneakers pounding against the marble steps as she ran. "Mr. Hartwell, stop!" Her voice carried across the courtyard with urgent authority. "That child needs medical attention." Caleb turned, his prepared press statement dying on his lips. The nurse's face was flushed with exertion, her name tag catching the morning light: Evelyn Moore, RN. "She's one of our dialysis patients." Evelyn called out, pushing through the crowd. "I recognized her from the ward." Before she could finish, a soft thud drew everyone's attention. Naomi had crumpled to the ground, her small body folding like a paper doll. The security guards jumped back, releasing her arms as if burned. "Someone call 911!" Evelyn shouted, already running toward the fallen child. The crowd stirred, several phones appearing as people dialed for help. Caleb stood rooted to the spot, his carefully constructed world tilting sideways. The girl lay motionless on the pavement, looking even smaller than before. Her collection bag had spilled, empty bottles rolling across the concrete like abandoned dreams. Evelyn knelt beside Naomi, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" She looked up at the gathering crowd, her eyes hard. "Back up! Give her air!" The wail of approaching sirens split the morning. Caleb's throat felt tight, his collar suddenly too constricting. He watched as Evelyn supported Naomi's head, speaking softly to keep her conscious. "Her mother's in critical condition," Evelyn explained, her voice carrying, clearly in the hushed courtyard. "End-stage renal failure. Naomi's been trying to help with medical expenses." She looked directly at Caleb, her words weighted with accusation. "That's why she collects bottles." The ambulance screamed to a stop, paramedics jumping out with practiced efficiency. They worked quickly, loading Naomi onto a stretcher. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, searching the crowd in confusion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Didn't mean to cause trouble." The apology hit Caleb like a physical blow. He found himself moving forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. "I'll follow in my car," he heard himself say. Evelyn's eyebrows rose. "Worried about bad press, Mr. Hartwell?" He straightened his tie, clinging to familiar gestures. Of course, this situation needs proper handling. But as he slid into his Tesla's leather interior, Caleb couldn't ignore the heavy weight settling in his chest. The image of Naomi collapsed on the pavement played, on repeat in his mind. He thought of his own daughter, safe at private school, and the knot in his chest tightened further. The ambulance led the way through morning traffic, its sirens parting the sea of cars. Caleb followed mechanically, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed repeatedly, likely his PR team already damage controlling the situation. but he couldn't bring himself to answer. At each red light, he remembered another detail. The tremor in Naomi's hands, the quiet dignity in her denial, the way she'd protected her bag of bottles even as she fell. He'd been so focused on his merger announcement, so quick to assume the worst. The hospital loomed ahead, its emergency entrance busy with activity. Caleb parked haphazardly, not bothering to check if he was in a proper spot. He reached the emergency room doors just as they were wheeling Naomi inside, Evelyn jogging alongside the stretcher. "Blood sugar's critically low," one paramedic reported. "Possible dehydration." "Get her to room 3, Evelyn commanded, already reaching for supplies. "And page Dr. Martinez." Caleb stood in the waiting room, feeling oddly lost without his usual entourage. A television mounted in the corner was already running the story. Shaky phone footage of the confrontation outside the hotel. He watched himself on screen, saw his own face twisted with baseless anger, and felt something crack in his carefully maintained facade. The automatic doors whooshed open behind him as more hospital staff hurried in. One of them was carrying a small, worn backpack, Naomi's belongings from the ambulance. It had fallen open slightly, revealing a crumpled piece of paper. A medical bill, Caleb realized, with an overwhelming sum circled in red. The knot in his chest transformed into a physical ache. He'd been so wrong, so carelessly cruel, and now a sick child lay in an emergency room because he'd been too important to see what was right in front of him. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Caleb Hartwell's face as he paced the sterile hallway. The antiseptic smell and squeaking of nurses' shoes against linoleum floors made his head pound. He loosened his silk tie, the same one he'd adjusted confidently just hours ago before meeting investors. Now it felt like it was choking him. Through the window of room 304, he could see Naomi's small form on the hospital bed, wrapped in white sheets that made her skin look even paler than before. IV lines snaked from her arm to hanging bags of clear fluid. The sight made his stomach clench. "Mr. Hartwell?" Nurse Evelyn Moore's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her eyes direct but not unkind. Her blue scrubs were wrinkled from a long shift, but she carried herself with quiet authority. "How is she?" Caleb asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "She's stable now. Severe dehydration and dangerously low blood sugar. Her body simply—" Evelyn paused, choosing her words carefully. "Her body didn't have any reserves left to draw from." Caleb's mind flashed back to the morning. The girl's trembling hands as she sorted through bottles, the way her collarbones had jutted out beneath her worn t-shirt. Signs he should have seen but chose to ignore. Instead, The memory of his public accusation burned in his throat like acid. He could still see the terror in her eyes when security approached. "I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than Evelyn. "No, you didn't," Evelyn agreed, but there was an edge to her voice. "Naomi's been coming to this hospital 3 times a week for the past year, not for herself, but with her mother, Lena Brooks. Ms. Brooks needs regular dialysis. The treatments that aren't fully covered by aid, well, they're expensive." She let that sink in before continuing. "Naomi's been skipping meals so her mother can afford the treatments. She collects bottles and cans before school most mornings. Every bit helps, she says." Caleb felt the weight of each word like a physical blow. The girl hadn't been trying to steal from him. She'd been searching for discarded bottles near his car, trying to save her mother's life 1 nickel at a time. The sound of monitors beeping drew his attention back to the room. Naomi stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. Her cracked lips moved, and Caleb found himself stepping closer to the window. "What is she saying?" he asked. Evelyn's expression softened. "She's praying. She does that a lot, always for others, rarely for herself. Through the glass they watched as Naomi's whispered words faded and she drifted back to sleep. The simple faith of it. This child, who had every reason to be bitter instead choosing to pray, struck something deep in Caleb's chest. He sank into one of the hard plastic chairs lining the hallway, his perfectly tailored suit out of place against the institutional furniture. The setting sun threw orange, light through the windows, making the corridor feel both warmer and somehow more lonely. "I've seen a lot of things in my years of nursing," Evelyn said quietly, sitting down next to him. "But there's something special about that girl. Despite everything life has thrown at her and her mother, she maintains this dignity, this grace." Caleb stared at his expensive leather shoes, remembering how he'd towered over Naomi that morning, using his position and power to intimidate a hungry child. The memory made him feel small in a way no failed business deal ever had. "The worst part is," Evelyn continued, her voice gentle but firm, "this didn't have to happen. If they'd had access to proper support, if someone had noticed sooner—" She let the words hang in the air. The corridor gradually emptied as visiting hours ended. Nurses changed shifts, speaking in hushed tones. Somewhere down the hall, a cleaning cart squeaked past. But Caleb remained seated, watching the rise and fall of Naomi's, chest through the window. In the growing darkness, he could see his reflection superimposed over her room. His carefully curated image of success and control now seemed like a hollow mask. The knot in his chest had grown into something he couldn't ignore or explain away as mere concern about public relations. The last rays of sunlight faded from the windows, leaving him alone with his thoughts in the dimmed hospital corridor. The quiet dignity of the child he had wronged. Her prayers, her sacrifice, her grace in the face of his cruelty, had shaken something loose in him. Something that felt uncomfortably like truth. As night settled over the hospital, Caleb Hartwell, the man who always had an answer, found himself sitting in silence, confronted by questions he'd never thought to ask. The only sound was the steady beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of air conditioning, a sterile lullaby for a conscience newly awake. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed, softly as evening settled over Mercy General. Shadows lengthened across the polished floors while nurses made their rounds, their shoes squeaking against the tiles. Caleb Hartwell stood at the window of Naomi's room, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, watching as the sky turned from blue to dusky purple. The steady beeping of monitors had become a familiar rhythm over the past few hours. He loosened his tie, aware of how out of place his expensive suit looked in the sterile hospital setting. His phone buzzed again, probably another message from his assistant about the missed meetings, but he couldn't bring himself to check it. A commotion down the hall caught his attention. 2 orderlies were carefully guiding a wheelchair toward Naomi's room. In it sat a slender woman, looking exhausted but somehow elegant even in a hospital gown. Her dark skin was ashen, and she leaned heavily against the chair's backrest, clearly drained from whatever treatment she'd received. Caleb stepped back into the shadows of the doorway, an inexplicable urge to stay hidden taking hold of him. He watched as the orderlies helped the woman, Lena Brooks he assumed, into the room. "Mama!" Naomi's voice, though weak, carried a joy that made the monitors skip a beat. The little girl tried to sit up in her bed, but her mother quickly raised a hand. "Stay still, baby," Lena said softly, her voice warm despite its weariness. "Mama's just fine right here." The orderlies positioned her wheelchair next to the bed, close enough for her to reach out and stroke Naomi's cheek. The tenderness of the gesture made something twist in Caleb's chest. He remembered how quickly he'd jumped to accusations that morning, how harshly he'd spoken to this child, who now looked so small in the hospital bed. "You scared me today," Lena whispered, brushing back Naomi's hair. "Mrs. Martinez from the corner store called me at dialysis to say you'd collapsed." "I'm sorry, Mama." Naomi's voice quivered. "I was trying to collect enough bottles before lunch, but it got so hot." Lena's hand trembled as she wiped away a tear from her daughter's cheek. "No more skipping meals, you hear me? God provides, baby. We just have to trust him." "Yes, Mama." Naomi's fingers played with the hospital bracelet on her wrist. Then, in a voice so quiet Caleb had to strain to hear, she added, "I saw him today, Mama. The man from your pictures." The air in the room seemed to still. Lena's hand froze mid-stroke. "What pictures, baby?" "The one in your special box. The man you said—" Naomi's voice grew even softer, trembling with emotion. "Mommy says you're my daddy, but you don't know yet." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, catching himself against the doorframe with a soft thud. The sound drew Lena's attention, and her head snapped towards the doorway. Their eyes met across the room. Recognition flickered across her face. First fear, then shock, her mouth forming a silent "Oh!" as the color drained from her already pale cheeks. She gripped the armrest of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles went white. Time seemed to freeze in that moment, the only sound the steady beeping of Naomi's monitors and the distant bustle of the hospital beyond. Caleb couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. His gaze dropped to Naomi's wrist, where the hospital bracelet caught the light from the window. The plastic band twisted slightly, and suddenly he was transported back to another time, another bracelet. A silver charm bracelet he'd given to a young woman 11 years ago, back when he was still in college, before his family's expectations and corporate ambitions had consumed his life, before his father had told him the lies that made him walk away. The memory he'd buried so deeply crashed through his carefully constructed walls. Lena's smile, as he'd fastened the bracelet around her wrist, the way the charms had tinkled when she'd thrown her arms. Around his neck, the promises they'd whispered under a summer moon. Promises he'd broken without knowing the full cost. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, pulling him back to the present moment. To this hospital room, where his past and present collided in the form of a small girl with his mother's eyes and Lena's gentle spirit. A daughter he never knew he had. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to step forward or retreat, while the truth of Naomi's whispered words echoed in his mind like thunder. The hospital corridor had grown quiet as evening settled into night. The steady beep of monitors and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Inside Naomi's room, the overhead lights had been dimmed, casting everything in a gentle glow that made the stark hospital equipment seem less intimidating. Nurse Thompson, a different nurse from the day shift, moved efficiently around Naomi's bed, checking readings and adjusting IV lines with practiced care. Evelyn Moore lingered near the doorway, having stayed well past her shift. She couldn't quite explain why, but something about this family's story pulled at her heart. Lena sat in the chair beside Naomi's bed, her own exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. She hadn't left her daughter's side since arriving, even though she clearly needed rest after her dialysis session. Caleb stood awkwardly by the window, his usual commanding presence diminished by the events of the day. As Nurse Thompson adjusted Naomi's blanket, the girl's arm shifted, and something caught Evelyn's eye. A worn friendship bracelet, its threads faded but still holding together. The kind teenagers often made for each other, with intricate patterns woven from embroidery floss. "That's a pretty bracelet," Evelyn commented softly, trying to keep the mood light. "Did you make it yourself, Naomi?" Before the sleeping girl could answer, Lena's hand moved protectively to her daughter's wrist. Fingers traced the braided threads with a familiarity that spoke of years of seeing it there. The simple question had caused tension to ripple through her body, though she tried to hide it. Caleb stepped forward from his place by the window, his expensive shoes making no sound on the floor. His eyes fixed on the bracelet with an intensity that seemed out of place for such a small thing. In the dim light, his face had lost its usual mask of confidence, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "I've seen that pattern before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those colors." Lena's fingers tightened around Naomi's wrist. "It was a long time ago," she said, each word careful and measured. Memories crashed over Caleb like waves, each one clearer than the last. A summer afternoon in the park, sitting on a blanket with Lena. His clumsy attempts to learn the braiding pattern she was teaching him. The way she'd laughed when he kept tangling the threads, her eyes bright with affection. He'd finally managed to make one bracelet, red, blue, and white threads woven together in a pattern that matched the one on Naomi's wrist perfectly. "I made that bracelet," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "For you, Lena. The summer before—" He trailed off, but the unfinished sentence hung heavy in the air. Before everything fell apart. Before the phone call that told him Lena had lost their baby. Before he'd thrown himself into building his company, using work to bury his grief. Lena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I gave it to her on her 7th birthday," she said quietly. "She wanted something of yours, even if she didn't know that's what it was." Evelyn and Nurse Thompson exchanged glances and quietly stepped out of the room, giving them privacy. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time as Caleb struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd believed for so many years. "The miscarriage," he said, the word sticking in his throat. "They told me. My father's lawyer called to say." "There was no miscarriage," Lena replied, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "They lied to you, Caleb. Your father's people made sure you believed what they wanted you to believe." Caleb sank into the chair on the other side of Naomi's bed, his legs no longer able to hold him. The girl lying there, the child he'd accused of theft just that morning, was his daughter, his flesh and blood. The truth he'd built his life around had been carefully constructed fiction. With trembling fingers, he reached for Naomi's other hand. The bracelet had slipped off her thin wrist while she slept. He picked it up, cradling it in his palm, as if it were made of glass instead of thread. The colors had faded from bright primary shades to soft, washed-out hues, but the pattern was unmistakable. He'd spent hours getting it right, wanting to impress Lena with his persistence. The hospital clock ticked past midnight, its red numbers casting a faint glow across the room. Caleb stared at the bracelet in his hand, feeling the weight of 10 years of lies pressing down on him. Everything he'd accomplished, every success he'd achieved, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of what he'd lost, what had been stolen from him. The bracelet was such a small thing, just threads woven together by inexperienced hands. But like the truth it represented, it had endured. It had waited patiently for this moment, when past and present would finally align, forcing him to see what had been hidden in plain sight all along. In the quiet of the hospital room, as Tuesday became Wednesday, Caleb Hartwell held a faded friendship bracelet and faced the reality that the foundation of his entire life, his drive for success, his inability to trust, his carefully maintained control, had been built on a lie crafted by others who thought they knew what was best for him. Naomi slept on peacefully, unaware of the revelation unfolding beside her bed. Her small face, so like his own, was relaxed in sleep, free from the fear and hurt he'd caused her that morning. The steady rise and fall of her chest seemed to mark time differently than the clock on the wall, marking moments of truth rather than minutes, of recognition rather than hours. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the sterile corridor as Caleb Hartwell walked purposefully through the entrance. In his hands, he carried 2 paper bags from Marie's bakery and a cardboard tray with 3 steaming cups. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, echoing his nervousness with each step. He paused outside room 412, taking a deep breath. Through the window, he could see Naomi sitting up in bed, her small frame dwarfed by the white hospital pillows. She was reading a worn paperback, her face peaceful despite everything that had happened. "Good morning," Caleb said softly, stepping into the room. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. I brought breakfast." Naomi looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the bags. A small smile tugged at her lips, catching Caleb off guard with its genuine warmth. "There's chocolate croissants, fruit, and hot chocolate," he continued, setting everything down on the rolling table. "And coffee for your mum." He glanced at Lena, who was watching him carefully from her chair by the window. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell," Naomi said quietly, closing her book. "That's really nice of you." Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with her politeness after how he'd treated her. "Listen, Naomi, about yesterday." He ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words. "I was wrong. Very wrong. I jumped to conclusions and hurt you, and I'm truly sorry." Naomi's fingers traced the pattern on her blanket. "It's okay. Sometimes people get scared and say mean things. Mum says we have to forgive them because maybe they're hurting too." Her simple wisdom hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He blinked rapidly, looking away from her honest gaze. "Your mum sounds very wise." "She is," Naomi agreed, reaching for a croissant. Flakes of pastry scattered across the blanket as she took a careful bite. Lena stood up slowly, her movements still weak from yesterday's dialysis. "Naomi, honey, would you mind if Mr. Hartwell and I stepped out to talk for a minute?" Naomi nodded, already focused on enjoying her breakfast. "Sure, Mum." Caleb followed Lena into the hallway, maintaining a respectful distance as she leaned against the wall for support. The morning bustle of the hospital continued around them, nurses checking charts, orderlies pushing carts, families visiting loved ones, but they might as well have been alone in their bubble of tension. "You never lost the baby," Caleb said quietly, the words hanging between them like smoke. Lena's fingers clutched her coffee cup tighter. "No, I didn't. But I got the call. They said—" His voice trailed off as anger and confusion warred on his face. "Victor Langston." Lena's voice was barely above a whisper, but the name hit Caleb like ice water. "He came to see me at the clinic, said you were destined for great things, that a baby would ruin everything you'd worked for. When I refused to—" She swallowed hard. "The next thing I knew, my medical records showed a miscarriage. My phone was disconnected. My apartment lease was suddenly terminated." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible. Victor was my mentor. He wouldn't—" "He did." Lena's eyes met his, years of pain evident in their depths. "I tried to reach you, but your number had changed. Your office wouldn't put my calls through. I was just a poor girl from the wrong side of town. Who would believe me over Victor Langston?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Caleb processed her words. Memories flooded back. Victor's increased involvement in his life that year, the sudden promotion, the carefully orchestrated introduction to his future wife at the company gala. All of it calculated, all of it built on a foundation of lies. "I need—" Caleb's throat felt dry. "I need to know for sure." Lena nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. I've been expecting this since yesterday. Within an hour, Caleb had made the necessary calls. A technician arrived with DNA testing kits, explaining the process in a professional tone that seemed at odds with the emotional weight of the moment. Naomi watched curiously as the inside of her cheek was swabbed, then Caleb's. "Results should be ready in 48 hours," the technician said, carefully labeling the samples. Caleb stared at the small tubes containing potential proof of the biggest lie in his life. Across the room, Naomi had returned to her book, seemingly unfazed by the morning's events. Lena sat beside her, one hand absently stroking her daughter's hair. The scene struck him with unexpected force. This quiet moment, between mother and daughter, filled with a love that had survived poverty, illness, and betrayal. He thought of all the moments like this he had missed, stolen from him by ambition and manipulation. As the technician packed up his equipment, the weight of the past decade settled over the room like a heavy blanket. None of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about what the test results might mean. Through the window, the morning sun continued its steady climb, indifferent to the lives it illuminated below. The elevator doors slid open to Caleb's penthouse apartment, and for the first time in 10 years, the gleaming surfaces and modern furnishings felt cold and unfamiliar. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor as he dropped his keys on the glass coffee table, the clinking sound sharp in the empty space. He loosened his tie and sank into the leather couch, his mind racing back to those phone calls from Lena years ago, calls he'd ignored because Victor had assured him it would be easier that way. The city lights twinkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, but Caleb barely noticed them. "I trusted him," he whispered to the empty room. "I trusted everything he said." Moving to his home office, Caleb pulled open a drawer he rarely touched. Inside lay a small stack of papers, hospital records from a decade ago, documenting what he'd believed was a miscarriage. His hands trembled as he read through them again, seeing them with new eyes. How had he accepted this so easily? Why hadn't he called Lena himself? The answer stung, because success had seemed more important then, because Victor had promised to handle everything, because it had been easier to believe the lie. Caleb's phone buzzed, another message from Victor asking about tomorrow's board meeting. He ignored it, just as he'd once ignored Lena's calls. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the kitchen, he opened his usual bottle of expensive wine, but couldn't bring himself to pour it. Instead, he found himself thinking about Naomi sorting bottles on the street, trying to help her mother survive. His daughter, the word still felt strange in his mind, had been struggling while he lived in luxury. Meanwhile, at Mercy General Hospital, Naomi sat cross-legged on her bed, her dinner tray pushed aside. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and her mother's gentle breathing from the chair beside her. "Dear God," Naomi whispered, her hands clasped together. "Thank you for bringing my daddy here. I know he was mad at first, but I saw something good in his eyes today. Please help him understand that you made him find us for a reason." Lena watched her daughter pray, amazed at the child's capacity for forgiveness. "Sweetheart, you should get some sleep. It's been a long day." "Just one more minute, Mama," Naomi said, her eyes still closed. "I want to make sure God knows exactly what to do with Daddy's heart." The word Daddy echoed in the room, full of hope and possibility. Lena felt tears welling up but quickly wiped them away. She'd learned long ago not to hope too much, but Naomi's faith was contagious. Morning came with soft rays of sunlight filtering through the hospital blinds. Caleb arrived earlier than usual, carrying several shopping bags. He'd spent hours the night before searching online for appropriate gifts for a 10-year-old girl, realizing he knew nothing about children's interests. "Good morning," he said awkwardly, standing in the doorway. Naomi's face lit up at his arrival, and the simple joy in her expression made his chest tight. "Hi, Mr. Hartwell." she replied politely. I brought you some things, he said, moving into the room. I thought you might be bored here. From the bags, he pulled out comfortable clothes in bright colors, several books ranging from chapter stories to art books, colored pencils, and a small tablet loaded with games and educational apps. He'd also included a soft blanket with butterflies, noticing the hospital bedding looked scratchy. Naomi's eyes widened at each item. These are for me. Yes, Caleb said, his voice softer than usual. I noticed you like to draw. The nurse mentioned it. He handed her a sketchbook, and Naomi ran her fingers over the clean pages reverently. Thank you, she whispered. Lena watched the interaction from her chair, her heart a mixture of gratitude and caution. When Naomi immediately opened one of the books and began reading, Caleb pulled up another chair. I didn't know what she likes, he admitted quietly to Lena. I should know these things. She loves stories, Lena offered. Always has. She makes up her own sometimes. Caleb nodded, watching Naomi turn pages carefully with her small fingers, the same fingers he'd accused of stealing just days ago. The shame of that moment washed over him again. Would you... He cleared his throat. Would you tell me more about her? About what I've missed? Lena studied him for a moment, then began, speaking softly about Naomi's first words, her early love of music, how she always tried to help others even when they had so little themselves. With each detail, Caleb felt the weight of lost years pressing down on him. As the morning progressed, Naomi showed Caleb her favorite parts of the books he'd brought. She read passages aloud, her voice growing more confident with each page. Without realizing it, Caleb had moved his chair closer to the bed, pointing out words she struggled with, listening intently to her stories. He didn't say the word father. He didn't make any promises. But when Naomi fell asleep mid-sentence, the book still open in her lap, Caleb carefully marked her place and tucked the butterfly blanket around her shoulders. His hand lingered for a moment, and in that quiet gesture was the beginning of something new, fragile as a butterfly's wing, but full of possibility. Looking up, he caught Lena's eye. They shared a moment of understanding, both aware of the delicate hope taking shape in that hospital room. It wasn't forgiveness yet, wasn't a family yet, but it was a start. The sterile hospital corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before Caleb as he paced, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. 2 days of waiting had felt like years. His phone buzzed constantly with work messages he couldn't bring himself to answer. Nothing mattered except the envelope Evelyn now held in her hands. The results are here, Mr. Hartwell, she said softly, extending the crisp white envelope toward him. Her kind eyes held no judgment, only quiet support. Caleb's fingers trembled as he took it. The paper felt impossibly heavy. He stared at the hospital logo in the corner, his heart hammering against his ribs. With a deep breath, he tore it open. The medical terminology blurred before his eyes until he found the sentence that would change everything. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. His legs gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair, the paper shaking in his grip. She's mine, he whispered, his voice cracking. She's really mine. The truth he'd been denied for 10 years crashed over him like a wave. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks as years of missed birthdays, first days of school, and precious moments he could never get back overwhelmed him. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Would you like me to get Lena? Unable to speak, Caleb nodded. Minutes later, Lena wheeled herself around the corner. She looked tired after her morning dialysis, but her eyes were alert and focused on him. It's true, he managed, holding out the results. Everything you told me, it was all true." Lena took the paper with trembling hands. As she read, tears welled up in her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of bitterness or anger. They were tears of relief, of a burden finally lifted after carrying it alone for so long. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she whispered. "But Victor made it clear what would happen if I did. He said you'd lose everything you'd worked for." Caleb moved to kneel beside her wheelchair. "I'm so sorry, Lena. I should have questioned it. Should have fought harder to reach you when you called." "We can't change the past," she said softly. "But Naomi never stopped believing you'd find us someday." Later that evening, after the doctors had finished their rounds, Caleb sat in the chair beside Naomi's bed. She looked stronger now. Some color returned to her cheeks. She'd arranged her new books carefully on the bedside table, gifts he'd brought yesterday, trying to make up for lost time. "Want to hear about my science project?" Naomi asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "I made a whole presentation about recycling and how it helps the Earth." "I'd love to hear about it," Caleb said, his throat tight with emotion. "We collected bottles and cans for 2 weeks," she explained, gesturing enthusiastically. "My teacher said I did the best job explaining why it matters. That's why I was collecting them that day. You know, when we met." Shame burned in Caleb's chest at the memory, but Naomi continued as if it didn't matter anymore. "I knew God had a plan," she said matter-of-factly, smoothing her blanket. "Mommy always said my daddy would come back when the time was right. I prayed every night." Caleb's vision blurred with tears again. "You never stopped believing?" Naomi shook her head, her smile radiant. "Nope. God doesn't forget about us. Sometimes he just works really slow." A laugh bubbled up through Caleb's tears. Out of the mouth of babes came wisdom that put his years of corporate strategy to shame. "Tell me more about school," he urged, leaning forward in his chair. "What's your favorite subject?" Naomi launched into stories about her teachers, her friends, and the classroom pet hamster named Cookie. She described the books she loved to read and how she helped younger kids with their math, homework during lunch. As she talked, Caleb watched his daughter, with wonder and growing love. Her gentle spirit, her quick mind, her unshakable faith. She was a miracle he'd almost missed completely. In the quiet of his heart, as Naomi's voice washed over him, Caleb made a silent, unbreakable promise. He would never leave again. No business deal, no corporate takeover, no amount of money would ever be more important than this precious girl who had waited so long for him to find his way back. The last rays of sunset painted the hospital room in soft gold, and Naomi's voice grew sleepy. She blinked heavily, fighting to keep her eyes open. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked, her words slightly slurred with exhaustion. "I'll be here," Caleb assured her, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. "I promise." As Naomi drifted off to sleep, Caleb remained in his chair, watching her peaceful face. The promise he'd made echoed in his heart, stronger than any contract he'd ever signed. This was where he belonged. This was what mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life making up for the time they'd lost. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting warm squares of light across the linoleum floor. Caleb sat at his laptop in the visitor's lounge, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Dark circles lingered under his eyes, but there was a new energy in his movements, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He opened his banking app and authorized a substantial transfer to cover Lena's outstanding medical bills. The amount made him blink, not because it was large to him, but because it represented months of struggle for Lena and Naomi. His throat tightened as he thought about them counting pennies while he lived in luxury. "Mr. Hartwell?" A nurse approached with some forms. These are the transfer papers for Mrs. Brooks to the private wing. Caleb nodded, signing quickly. Please ensure everything is handled discreetly. He paused, then added softly, and make sure they have whatever they need. The nurse smiled knowingly. Of course, sir. We've already moved Mrs. Brooks to a private room with better dialysis access. The specialists you requested will see her this afternoon. Walking down the hallway to Naomi's room, Caleb heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Laughter, clear and bright, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. He peered through the doorway to see Naomi sitting up in bed, giggling at something on the small TV mounted on the wall. Her color had improved dramatically, and the IV line was finally gone from her arm. She looked up as he entered, and her smile didn't fade. That simple fact nearly brought him to his knees. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're looking better today." "I feel better," Naomi replied, smoothing her hospital gown with careful fingers. "The nurse said I can go for a walk if someone goes with me." Caleb glanced at the monitoring equipment, now showing strong, vital signs. "Would you like to see the garden? I noticed it earlier. They have some pretty impressive flowers." Naomi's eyes lit up. "Can we really?" "Of course. Let me just check with your mother first." He stepped into the connecting room where Lena rested after her morning dialysis session. She looked up from her book, and he saw the worry lines around her eyes had softened somewhat. "The new treatment schedule is helping," she said quietly, answering his unspoken question. "Thank you, Caleb." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. I should have." But she held up a hand, stopping him. "Not now. Naomi wants to go outside, doesn't she? Take her. She's been staring at those gardens for days." Back in Naomi's room, a nurse helped her into a wheelchair, but Naomi insisted on standing. "I can walk," she said firmly. "I've been practicing with the physical therapist." Caleb offered his hand without thinking, and she took it, naturally, her small fingers wrapping around his. They walked slowly down the hallway together, matching their pace. He found himself unconsciously adjusting his stride to her shorter steps, just as he was adjusting everything else in his life to make room for this miracle he never knew he had. The hospital garden was a peaceful oasis, with winding paths between carefully tended flower beds. Stone benches sat in quiet corners, and a small fountain burbled cheerfully in the center. Naomi's face glowed with delight as she took it all in. "Look at the butterflies," she exclaimed, pointing to some orange monarchs flitting between purple cone flowers. "They're so pretty." They walked slowly along the path, Naomi occasionally stopping to examine a particular flower or watch a bee buzz past. Caleb found himself seeing everything through her eyes, the simple beauty he'd always been too busy to notice. "You know," Naomi said thoughtfully as they sat on a bench near the fountain, "I used to see you on TV sometimes or in magazines at the doctor's office." Caleb tensed slightly, remembering his public persona. Cold, efficient, successful. "What did you think?" he asked carefully. "You looked sad," she said simply, "like you were carrying something heavy that nobody could see." The observation, so innocent and yet so profound, caught him off guard. "I suppose I was," he admitted. "But I never hated you," she continued, watching a sparrow hop along the path. "Mommy taught me that hate just makes your heart sick, and I knew God had a plan." "How?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious. "How could you have such faith?" Naomi smiled, and in that moment she looked so much like Lena it made his chest ache. "Because good things take time. Like flowers, you have to plant the seeds and wait, and sometimes it rains, and sometimes it's hard. But if you trust and keep believing, beautiful things grow." Caleb looked around the garden, at the riot of colors and life surrounding them, and felt something shift inside him. All his plans for damage control, all his careful strategies about managing this situation, they suddenly seemed small and shallow compared to the simple wisdom of his daughter. "I think," he said slowly, "I have a lot to learn from you." Naomi squeezed his hand. "That's okay. We have time now." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fountain sparkle in the sunlight. For the first time in his adult life, Caleb felt no urge to check his phone or rush to the next meeting. The weight of his empire, his reputation, all the careful lies and maneuvering that had built his success, it all felt distant and unimportant compared to this moment. A warm breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and Caleb found himself smiling, really smiling, not the practiced expression he used for cameras and boardrooms. He realized with startling clarity that this was happiness, pure, unqualified joy that asked nothing in return, looking at Naomi, who was now trying. To coax the sparrow closer with gentle whispers, Caleb felt certain he could make everything right. He would ensure Lena got the best medical care available. He would provide Naomi with everything she needed, and more importantly, he would be there for her, really there, in all the ways that mattered. The past. The setting sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caleb's corner office. He stood gazing at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness, his hands clasped behind his back. The peaceful moment shattered as his office door burst open. "Mr. Hartwell, we need to talk." Marcus Chen, head of his legal team, strode in with 2 other lawyers trailing behind him. Their faces were grim. Caleb turned slowly, noting the thick folders clutched in their hands. "What couldn't wait until morning?" "We've learned about the DNA test, sir." Marcus's voice was tight with concern. "And about the girl at Mercy General." A chill ran down Caleb's spine. Hadn't told anyone about the test. "How did you—" "Victor Langston contacted us directly." Sandra Peters, another senior lawyer, stepped forward. "He's concerned about potential implications." Caleb's jaw clenched at the mention of Victor's name. The man who had orchestrated the lie that kept him from his daughter for 10 years. Marcus spread several documents across Caleb's mahogany desk. "Sir, public acknowledgement of this child would be catastrophic for the company. Our shareholders—" "Her name is Naomi," Caleb cut in sharply. "Naomi," Marcus continued smoothly. "Her existence raises serious questions about past corporate dealings. Mr. Langston's involvement in certain matters could trigger investigations that would impact everyone." Sandra cleared her throat. "Including you, Mr. Hartwell. The board would view this as a betrayal of trust. The stock would plummet." "We're talking about my daughter," Caleb said, his voice low but fierce. "We understand this is personal," Marcus replied. "That's why we've prepared a solution." He pulled out another document. "We can arrange for Ms. Brooks and the child to be relocated comfortably. Private schooling, medical care, housing, all through discreet channels. You could provide for them without public acknowledgement." Caleb stared at the paper, his stomach churning. "You want me to deny her? We want you to protect everything you've built." Sandra insisted. "Think of your employees, the families that depend on this company's stability." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Caleb's shoulders. He thought of the thousands of people working for him, their mortgages, their children's college funds, their retirement plans, all potentially at risk. "Victor Langston has influence with the board," Marcus added quietly. "If this becomes public, he'll make sure you take the fall with him. Everything you've worked for. Gone." Caleb sank into his leather chair, suddenly exhausted. The lawyers continued talking, their voices blending into a dull roar as he remembered Naomi's smile that morning in the hospital garden. The way her small hand had felt in his. the trust in her eyes. "We'll need your decision quickly," Marcus was saying. "The longer we wait, I'll think about it," Caleb interrupted, standing abruptly. "That's all for tonight." The lawyers exchanged glances but gathered their papers without argument. At the door, Marcus paused. "Sir, I know this is difficult, but sometimes protecting people means making hard choices." After they left, Caleb sat in the darkening office for a long time. Finally, he grabbed his keys and headed for his car. The drive to the hospital seemed longer than usual, each traffic light an eternity of doubt and internal struggle. The hospital corridors were quiet at this late hour. Caleb's footsteps echoed as he made his way to Naomi's room. He paused in the doorway, watching his daughter sleep. Lena dozed in a chair nearby, her face peaceful despite the dialysis port visible beneath her sleeve. Naomi stirred, her eyes fluttering open. A smile spread across her face when she saw him. "Daddy, you came back." The word "daddy" hit him like a physical blow. He forced a smile but couldn't make himself move closer to the bed. "Are you okay?" Naomi asked, her voice small and concerned. "You look sad." "I'm fine," he managed, "just tired from work." Lena woke then, immediately sensing the tension in the room. She studied Caleb's face with knowing eyes. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Naomi asked hopefully. "The doctor said I might get to go outside again." Caleb opened his mouth to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. The silence stretched too long. Naomi's smile faded slightly. She pulled her stuffed bear closer, a subtle gesture of self-protection that made Caleb's heart ache. I'll try," he finally said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Something shifted in Naomi's expression, a shadow of understanding beyond her years. She nodded slowly, her fingers working at the worn bracelet on her wrist. Lena stood, her movement deliberately calm. "Naomi, sweetheart, it's late. You should try to sleep." "Okay, Mommy." Naomi's voice was barely a whisper. She looked at Caleb one more time, then turned onto her side, facing away from the door. Caleb stood frozen, wanting to go to her, to promise he would never leave again. But the lawyer's words echoed in his mind, along with the weight of obligations and consequences. He took a step backward into the hallway. "Good night," he said softly, unsure if Naomi even heard him. As he walked away, the distance between them seemed to grow with each step, stretching wider than the 10 years they'd already lost. Behind him, in the quiet hospital room, a little girl clutched her bear and tried to understand why her father's heart suddenly felt so far away again. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across Naomi's bed. She sat up slowly, her small hands smoothing the wrinkled blanket as she watched the door. The clock on the wall ticked past 8 o'clock, then 9. Her father had promised to bring her favorite cereal for breakfast, but the chair beside her bed remained empty. "He's probably just stuck in traffic, baby," Lena said softly from her bed across the room. But even as she spoke the words, worry creased her forehead. Naomi nodded, trying to keep her smile bright. "That's okay, Mommy. The doctors say I'm getting stronger every day." She fiddled with the worn bracelet on her wrist, turning it round and round. The morning dragged on. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and bringing medications, but still no Caleb. By 11 o'clock, Naomi's shoulders had begun to droop, though she kept her eyes fixed hopefully on the doorway. Just before lunch, voices drifted in from the hallway. Naomi recognized her mother's social worker, Ms. Martinez, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Curious, she slipped out of bed and padded closer to the door in her hospital socks. "Generous offer for relocation," Ms. Martinez was saying. "New apartment, Fully furnished. School arrangements already made. I don't understand. Lena's voice trembled slightly. Why now? Why so suddenly? The foundation sponsoring this wants to move quickly. They're suggesting next week. Next week? Lena's voice rose sharply before dropping again. But we just found... things were finally... Naomi pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. She knew what they weren't saying. They wanted to send her and Mommy away because of him, because of her daddy, because she had made everything complicated. Think about what's best for Naomi. Ms. Martinez continued gently. A fresh start, better schools, proper medical care for you both. Naomi slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, hugging her knees to her chest. The bracelet felt heavy on her wrist now, like it was weighing her down with all the hopes she'd carried for so long. When Lena returned to the room, she found Naomi curled up in the corner, tears streaming silently down her face. Oh, sweetheart. Lena rushed to her daughter, gathering her into her arms. What's wrong? It's my fault, Naomi whispered, her voice breaking. Daddy doesn't want us anymore because I messed everything up. I shouldn't have said anything about being his daughter. I shouldn't have... No, baby, no. Lena rocked her gently. None of this is your fault. Sometimes grown-ups sometimes things are complicated in ways that aren't fair. Naomi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But I prayed so hard, Mommy. Every single night. I asked God to bring Daddy back to us, to make us a family. Her lower lip trembled. Did God make a mistake? Did he hear me wrong? Lena's heart cracked at the raw pain in her daughter's voice. She had watched Naomi's unwavering faith sustain them through years of hardship, through hungry nights and long hospital stays, through endless appointments and worried looks from doctors. Never once had her little girl's spirit dimmed. Come here, baby. Lena helped Naomi back to her bed, tucking the blanket around her thin shoulders. She sat on the edge of the mattress, choosing her words carefully. God doesn't make mistakes. Sometimes his answers just look different than what we expected. But Naomi turned her face toward the window, tears still falling. Her small fingers wrapped around the bracelet, clutching it like it might disappear too. I just wanted him to love us, she whispered, so quietly Lena almost missed it. The room grew quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the muffled sounds of the hospital beyond their door. Lena watched helplessly as her daughter's shoulders shook with silent sobs, each one a prayer gone unanswered, each one a dream slipping away. Naomi held the bracelet tighter, pressing the worn metal into her palm until it hurt. Maybe if she held on hard enough, she could keep just this one piece of him. Maybe if she prayed harder, believed stronger. But for the first time in her young life, the words of prayer wouldn't come. They stuck in her throat like the tears she couldn't stop, leaving only the ache of a faith tested beyond its limits, and a heart too young to understand why love sometimes looked like walking away. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the window, painting everything in shades of gold. But Naomi didn't see its beauty. She kept her eyes closed, holding onto the bracelet like an anchor in a storm, while silent tears traced paths down her cheeks and onto the hospital pillow beneath her head. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Lena's breathing became increasingly labored. Her face had grown pale, and a sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead. The morning's emotional strain had taken its toll, and her body was struggling to cope. Blood pressure's dropping, a nurse called out, her voice tight with concern. We need to get her to dialysis now. Naomi stood in the corner of the room, her small hands twisting the hem of her hospital gown as she watched the medical team wheel her mother's bed towards the door. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She'd learned long ago that crying wouldn't change anything. Evelyn Moore appeared at Naomi's side, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Your mama's going to be just fine, sweetheart. This is just a precaution." But the worry in Evelyn's eyes told a different story. Once Lena was safely in the dialysis unit, Evelyn retreated to the nurse's station and picked up the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before dialing Caleb's number. 3 rings later, his voicemail picked up. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice firm but tired. "I know you're dealing with complicated matters, but your daughter needs you." "Naomi!" Evelyn glanced at the small figure curled up in the waiting room chair. "She's losing hope, sir, and I've never seen that happen before, not even during the hardest times." Across town, in the gleaming glass tower of Hartwell Technologies, Caleb sat alone in his boardroom. The leather chair that usually felt like a throne now seemed to swallow him whole. Papers were scattered across the polished table, legal documents, PR strategies, damage control scenarios. His phone buzzed again, probably another message from his crisis management team. He ignored it. Instead, his mind wandered back to yesterday morning, when he'd heard Naomi praying in her hospital room. She'd thought she was alone, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dear God, thank you for bringing my daddy back. Even if he's scared right now, I know you didn't make a mistake." Caleb's throat tightened at the memory. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he'd helped build. From up here, everything looked small and manageable. Problems could be solved with money, power, or influence. But down there, in a hospital room, sat a little girl whose faith in both God and her father was crumbling, and no amount of money could fix that. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Victor Langston's name on the screen, the same man who'd orchestrated the lie that had kept Caleb from his daughter for 10 years, the same man who'd helped build this empire, brick by corrupt brick. Caleb's reflection stared back at him from the window. He barely recognized himself in the expensive suit and carefully maintained facade. Success had been his god for so long, the metric by which he measured his worth. But what was it worth if it cost him his soul? A memory surfaced of Naomi collecting bottles outside the hotel, her hands shaking from hunger while he'd stood there in his $1,000 shoes and accused her of theft. The shame of it burned in his chest. His phone began to ring again. The board meeting would start in 5 minutes. They were waiting for him to sign off on the strategy, deny paternity, relocate Lena and Naomi quietly, maintain plausible deniability. The smart play. The safe play. Caleb looked down at his hands, remembering how small Naomi's had felt in his when they walked through the hospital garden. She'd told him about her favorite subjects in school, her dreams of becoming a doctor, her unwavering belief that God had a plan for everyone, even him. The boardroom phone began to ring, its sound harsh and demanding. His cell phone buzzed simultaneously, messages flooding in from lawyers, PR teams, and board members. The noise felt like it was closing in on him, a cage built of his own ambition. Caleb reached for his suit jacket, draped over the back of his chair. The phones continued their urgent chorus as he walked to the boardroom door. Each step felt heavier than the last, but something had shifted inside him. The weight he carried now wasn't from walking away from the meeting. It was from all the years he'd walked away from what really mattered. His phone lit up again with another call, but he didn't even glance at it. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Caleb stepped inside. As he descended from his lofty perch, the incessant alerts from his phone continued, each one representing another piece of the carefully constructed world he'd built. Let it fall, he thought. Some things were worth more than empires. The phones kept ringing, but Caleb Hartwell was no longer listening. The Grand Ashford Hotel's ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of shareholders and investors sat in neat rows, their faces lit by the blue glow of their phones as they waited for the annual summit to begin. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and large screens flanked the stage, displaying the company's logo in stark white against deep blue. Caleb Hartwell stood behind the thick velvet curtains, his usually pristine suit feeling like armor that no longer fit. His phone vibrated constantly in his pocket, messages from his legal team, no doubt warning him one last time. He ignored them all. The stage manager approached with a headset. 5 minutes, Mr. Hartwell. The live stream is already running with over 10,000 viewers. Caleb nodded, his throat dry. He thought of Naomi in her hospital bed, of her quiet prayers and unwavering faith. He thought of Lena, who had carried the weight of lies for so many years without becoming bitter. Their strength made his own facade seem hollow. The company president took the stage first, his voice booming through the speakers as he welcomed everyone. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, please welcome our CEO, Caleb Hartwell. Polite applause filled the room. Caleb walked out, the spotlight harsh and revealing. Instead of going to the podium with its prepared speech, he moved to center stage. The teleprompter blinked silently with words he would not read. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm supposed to talk about quarterly earnings and projected growth, but there's something more important we need to discuss." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Victor Langston's face tightened with concern. "Last week, I accused a child of trying to steal from me outside this very hotel." Caleb's words rang clear through the silence. "I was wrong. That child was my daughter, though I didn't know it at the time." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Camera flashes sparked like lightning. On the screens, Caleb could see his own face, pale but determined. 10 years ago, I was told the woman I loved had lost our baby. I believed it without question because it was convenient for my ambitions." His eyes found Victor, who was now reaching for his phone. But that was a lie orchestrated by someone I trusted, someone who saw a young mother and her child as obstacles to corporate success. Security personnel moved toward Victor as he tried to stand. Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger. Medical records were forged, evidence was destroyed, a mother was pressured into silence, and a child grew up without her father. The words felt like stones lifting from his chest. Victor Langston, my former mentor, arranged it all, and I, focused only on my career, never looked deeper. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters sprang to their feet, phones recording. Victor struggled against the security guards now flanking him, his face twisted with rage. "My daughter's name is Naomi Brooks. Her mother is Lena Brooks. They have lived in poverty while I built this company on a foundation of lies." Caleb's voice cracked slightly. "Naomi collects bottles for recycling money to help pay for her mother's medical bills. She prays every night, even for the father who didn't know she existed." Tears threatened, but Caleb pressed on. "I stand here knowing this confession will cost me everything I've built, but I've learned that success means nothing if you sacrifice your soul to achieve it." He could see his lawyers rushing down the aisles, trying to reach the stage. Behind him, board members whispered urgently. But Caleb stood his ground. "To Lena Brooks, I am deeply sorry for believing the worst instead of fighting for the truth. To my daughter Naomi, your faith and forgiveness have taught me what real strength looks like." Police officers entered the ballroom, moving purposefully toward Victor. The older man's face had gone from red to ashen as he realized escape was impossible. "I'm providing all evidence of these crimes to the authorities," Caleb announced. "Every forged document, every illegal transaction, every act of coercion will be revealed. The truth matters more than stock prices or corporate image." The screens behind him showed his words reaching thousands online. Comments flooded the live stream. Shock, anger, support, all mixing, together in a digital tide. I know this announcement will impact many of you financially. I accept full responsibility for my part in this deception. Caleb straightened his shoulders. But I will no longer protect lies that hurt innocent people. My daughter deserves better. Every child deserves better. As police led Victor away in handcuffs, Caleb removed his company pin and placed it on the podium. Camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing the moment his carefully constructed world crumbled by choice. Thank you for your attention. There will be no questions at this time. He stepped back from the microphone, ignoring the shouts from reporters and the chaos erupting in the audience. Walking off stage, Caleb passed stunned board members and frantic executives. His phone had finally stopped buzzing. Perhaps his lawyers had given up. The backstage area was a blur of movement and urgent voices, but Caleb felt strangely peaceful. A security guard opened a side door, and Caleb stepped out into the evening air. Behind him, he could hear the pandemonium continuing in the ballroom. His career was in ruins, his reputation shattered. But for the first time since he was young, his conscience was clear. The same bright sun that had witnessed his cruel accusation now set on his moment of truth. Caleb loosened his tie, took a deep breath, and walked away from the empire he had built on silence. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, painting warm squares on the sterile floor. Unlike yesterday's media circus, the hallway was quiet now, filled only with the gentle hum of medical equipment and soft footsteps of mourning nurses. Caleb Hartwell walked slowly, his expensive suit replaced by a simple blue sweater and jeans. His shoulders carried none of their usual rigid pride. Instead, they seemed lighter, as if unburdened. Outside Naomi's room, he paused to catch his breath. Through the glass, he could see her sitting cross-legged on the bed, drawing in a sketchbook Evelyn had brought her. The sight made his heart ache with a mixture of love and regret. When he stepped inside, Naomi looked up. Her dark eyes widened, and the pencil slipped from her fingers. "Hi," Caleb said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Before Naomi could respond, Caleb crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside her bed. His hands trembled as he reached for hers. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry I was afraid. I'm sorry I almost chose my company over you. I'm sorry for everything, from that first day outside the hotel until now." Naomi's small fingers squeezed his. "Daddy," she said simply, and the word broke something open inside him. "You were right to trust God," Caleb continued, his voice shaking. "He brought me back to you. And I promise with everything I am, that I'll never leave again." Without hesitation, Naomi slipped off the bed and threw her arms around his neck. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered against his shoulder. "I just knew it." Caleb held her close, amazed at how perfectly she fit in his arms, at how completely she had already forgiven him. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, this miracle he had almost thrown away. From the doorway came a small sound. Lena sat in her wheelchair, Evelyn standing supportively behind her. Tears streamed down Lena's face as she watched father and daughter embrace. "The news is everywhere," Evelyn said gently, holding up her phone. "They arrested Victor Langston an hour ago. The FBI had apparently been building a case against him for months. Your confession just gave them the final piece they needed." Caleb nodded, still holding Naomi. "Good," he said simply. He didn't care about Victor anymore, or the company, or his reputation. None of it mattered compared to this moment. Evelyn smiled, scrolling through her phone. "Your company's stock dropped when you first started speaking yesterday, but it's already stabilizing. People are calling you brave. There's a hashtag trending. Truth over profit. Thousands of people are sharing stories about choosing family over fortune. I don't deserve their support, Caleb said quietly. Yes, you do, Naomi insisted, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were bright with certainty. You told the truth even though it was hard. That's what matters. Lena wheeled closer, reaching out to touch Caleb's arm. She's right, she said softly. What you did yesterday, that took real courage. A knock at the door made them all turn. Dr. Chen stood there, holding a tablet and wearing a broad smile. Ms. Brooks? She said, I have some extraordinary news. A new private foundation just established a fund specifically for kidney transplant candidates who've been denied coverage. You've been accepted as their first recipient. Lena's hand flew to her mouth. What? But how? The Naomi Brooks Foundation, Caleb said quietly. I set it up last night after the summit. It's funded by my personal assets, not the company's. No one can touch it. But that must have cost. Lena began. Caleb shook his head. Money means nothing if we don't use it to help others. This foundation will help hundreds of families like ours. No one should have to choose between eating and getting medical care. Naomi hugged him again, tighter this time. See? She whispered. God had a plan all along. Dr. Chen explained the details, how quickly they could begin donor matching, the improved success rates with better anti-rejection medications, the comprehensive coverage that would ensure Lena received the best possible care. Lena listened in stunned silence, tears flowing freely now. Evelyn squeezed her shoulder supportively, while Naomi bounced with excitement. Mommy's going to get better? She asked Dr. Chen. The doctor nodded, smiling warmly. With a successful transplant, your mom should be able to live a full, healthy life. No more dialysis. Caleb watched, as joy transformed Naomi's face, making her whole being shine. This was what mattered, not stock prices or shareholder confidence or corporate empires. This moment, this family, this love that he had almost lost to fear and pride. Thank you, Jesus! Naomi exclaimed, throwing her arms up in celebration. Her pure, uncomplicated faith touched everyone in the room. Thank you, Lena said softly to Caleb, her eyes full of forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. He shook his head. No more thanks needed between us. We're family. This is what family does. We take care of each other. Naomi wrapped one arm around her mother and one around her father, pulling them close together. We're going to be okay now, she said with absolute certainty. All of us. And in that moment, surrounded by the love of the daughter he had almost lost and the woman he had wronged, Caleb knew she was right. Whatever came next, media storms, legal battles, corporate restructuring, none of it could touch this. Truth. He had finally chosen love over fear, family over fortune, and found something far more precious than success. The morning sun continued to pour through the windows, warming them all as they held each other close. A family broken and mended, lost and found, finally whole. The morning sun streams through the hospital window, painting warm stripes across Lena's recovery room. 6 weeks have passed since her successful kidney transplant, and the change in her is remarkable. Color has returned to her cheeks, and her eyes sparkle with renewed energy. She sits up in bed, no longer tethered to the dialysis machine that had been her constant companion for so long. Look at my homework, Mom! Naomi bursts into the room, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her school uniform is neat and pressed, and her braids are tied with bright yellow ribbons. She pulls out a paper covered in gold stars. I got everything right on my math test! Lena beams at her daughter, reaching out to squeeze her hand. That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Caleb follows behind, carrying a vase of fresh flowers. He's dressed more casually these days in khakis and a light blue button-down shirt. The sharp business suits have been relegated to the back of his closet. Dark circles under his eyes hint at long nights spent handling the transition at his company, but his smile is genuine and relaxed. "Those aren't just any gold stars," he says, setting the flowers on the windowsill. "Tell your mum about your special project." Naomi bounces on her toes, practically glowing with excitement. "Every time we get a gold star, we can trade it in for recycling bins at school. I told everyone how important it is to help the earth and people in need. Now my whole class is collecting bottles and cans." She's quite the environmental advocate, Caleb says proudly. The recycling program she started has spread to 3 other schools already. Lena's eyes fill with happy tears. "You've come so far from collecting bottles alone on the street, baby girl." The memory of that day outside the hotel hangs in the air for a moment, but it no longer carries the same sting. Healing has slowly replaced hurt, one day at a time. A nurse pokes her head in, clipboard in hand. "Time for your physical therapy, Ms. Brooks." "Race you to the therapy room, Mum," Naomi challenges, knowing full well her mother needs to take it slow. Lena laughs, carefully swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Not quite ready for racing yet, sweetie, but I'll get there." Caleb moves to help her into the wheelchair, his movements gentle and practiced. These weeks of recovery have taught him patience he never knew he possessed. The man who once rushed through life pursuing profit now understands the value of moving at someone else's pace. "The board meeting went well yesterday," he mentions casually as they make their way down the hall. "They've accepted my decision to step down as CEO. I'll stay on as a senior advisor, but that's it." "Are you sure that's what you want?" Lena asks, though she already knows the answer. Caleb watches Naomi skip ahead of them, chattering with the nurse about her school's recycling contest. "I've never been more sure of anything. The company will do fine without me at the helm. There are more important things now." The physical therapy room is bright and cheerful, with large windows overlooking a garden. As Lena works with her therapist, doing exercises to rebuild her strength, Naomi pulls out her homework. Caleb sits beside her, helping her with a science worksheet about the water cycle. "See, Daddy, like how the dialysis machine cleaned Mommy's blood in cycles before, but now her new kidney does it naturally," Naomi explains, drawing careful arrows between cloud and rain illustrations. Caleb marvels at how she connects everything back to helping others. The anger and pride that once drove his life seem foolish compared to his daughter's simple wisdom. Later that afternoon, Dr. Martinez reviews Lena's latest test results. "Everything looks excellent," she announces. "I think we can discuss discharge plans for next week." "Really?" Naomi claps her hands. "Mommy can come home?" Home is a new apartment Caleb helped them find, close to both Naomi's school and his place. He'd offered to buy them a house, but Lena insisted on maintaining some independence. The apartment is their fresh start, modest but comfortable, with plenty of natural light and a small balcony perfect for container gardening. "Speaking of home," Caleb says, checking his watch, "we should get going if we're going to pick up dinner. The new foundation launches tomorrow, and I promised Naomi we'd celebrate tonight." The Hartwell Medical Access Foundation, created to help families afford life-saving treatments, is Caleb's way of turning past wrongs into future good. The first recipients have already been selected. 3 children awaiting kidney transplants, their families struggling just as Lena and Naomi had. "Can we get pizza?" Naomi asks hopefully. "With extra cheese?" "Extra cheese and whatever toppings you want." Caleb agrees. "We'll bring it back here and have a proper family dinner." An hour later, they're gathered around a small table in Lena's hospital room. The smell of pepperoni and cheese fills the air as they pass paper plates and napkins. Naomi tells animated stories about her new friends at school, her face glowing with happiness. Lena watches her daughter and ex-lover, now tentative friend and co-parent, sharing a laugh over Naomi's impression of her science teacher. The bitterness she carried for so long has melted away, replaced by cautious optimism for their future, as a unique but united family. "Oh, I almost forgot!" Naomi reaches into her backpack and pulls out 3 bracelets made of braided string. "I made these in art class. Green for Mum because it's the color of healing, blue for Dad because it's calm, like the ocean now, and yellow for me because it's happy." She passes them out solemnly, and they all tie them on their wrists. Caleb touches his gently, remembering another bracelet that had brought truth to light. But this one represents something new. Not secrets revealed, but promises kept. The pizza grows cold as they talk and laugh, sharing hopes for the future. Naomi describes her plans to start a weekend tutoring program where kids can earn points toward food bank donations. Lena talks about maybe going back to school herself once she's fully recovered. Caleb listens to them both, his heart full of a joy no business success had ever given him. Through the window, they can see the same sun that had once exposed their painful past now setting on their healing present. The fear that had haunted all their lives, fear of poverty, fear of truth, fear of love itself, has no place in the warmth of their shared laughter and simple cheese pizza. Naomi gets sauce on her chin, and both parents reach to wipe it at the same time. Their hands bump, and instead of awkwardness, they share a knowing smile. They are finding their way, step by step, into this new chapter of their story. The autumn sun painted golden highlights across the playground of Washington Elementary School. Colorful bins lined the walkway, each labeled with carefully drawn pictures showing what items belonged inside. Students bustled about, carrying bags of recyclables, while parents watched from folding chairs set up on the grass. Naomi Brooks stood confidently at a small podium made from recycled cardboard, her braids tied with bright ribbons that matched her new school uniform. Her eyes sparkled with purpose as she addressed the growing crowd. "Welcome everyone to our first Recycling for Hope fundraiser." Her voice carried clearly across the schoolyard. "Every bottle and can you bring helps families who need medical care." Caleb Hartwell watched from the sidelines, his suit jacket draped, over one arm in the warm afternoon. Pride swelled in his chest as he observed his daughter commanding attention not through force or power, but through genuine compassion. Beside him, Lena sat in a comfortable wheelchair, her color healthy and her smile bright. The successful kidney transplant had given her a new lease on life. "That's our girl," Lena whispered, squeezing Caleb's hand. "She's amazing," he replied softly, "just like her mother." Students approached Naomi with questions about sorting materials. She answered each one patiently, just as she had shown patience with him during those first awkward days at the hospital. Her forgiveness had changed everything. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change. After his public confession, Caleb had stepped down as CEO, choosing instead to serve as chairman of the new Brooks Foundation, named in honor of the women who taught him the true meaning of strength. The foundation focused on medical assistance for single-parent, families, and children's healthcare initiatives. "And remember," Naomi continued, gesturing to the collection bins, "every item we save from the trash helps save the earth too, just like every act of kindness helps save a heart." Several parents wiped tears from their eyes. They knew the story. It had made national headlines. The wealthy CEO who had accused a sick child of theft, only to discover she was his daughter. The corruption exposed, the truth revealed, and the family reunited. But more powerful than the scandal was the message of redemption. Caleb thought back to that morning outside the Grand Ashford Hotel, when status and image had meant everything to him. How empty his penthouse had felt, how hollow his achievements. Now he lived in a modest house near Lena and Naomi's neighborhood, where morning coffee on the porch meant more than board meetings ever had. My mom always said God works in mysterious ways. Naomi addressed the crowd. When I was collecting bottles before, it was because we needed help. But something wonderful happened. I found my daddy, and he showed me that sometimes people just need a chance to show their true hearts. Lena reached up to squeeze Caleb's hand again as tears filled his eyes. He'd lost millions in stock value after his confession, faced legal battles over Victor's crimes, and weathered a storm of media attention. But watching Naomi now, healthy, happy, and helping others, he knew he'd gained everything that mattered. Students began sorting through the day's collections, counting bottles and cans. Naomi stepped down from her podium to help, showing the same careful attention she'd once used while searching through trash. But now she wore new shoes instead of worn-out ones, and her hands were steady and strong. "Mr. Hartwell?" called Mrs. Martinez, Naomi's teacher. "Would you like to say a few words about the foundation?" Caleb shook his head with a gentle smile. This is Naomi's moment. She's the real leader here. The afternoon drew to a close. Naomi approached her parents. Her eyes shone with joy as she reached for the bracelet she'd worn faithfully for so many years, the one that had helped reveal the truth. "Daddy," she said softly, taking Caleb's hand and placing the worn bracelet in his palm. "We don't need this anymore. We found each other." Caleb stared at the simple band that had carried so much meaning. Tears fell freely now as he pulled Naomi into a tight hug, feeling Lena's arms wrap around them both. Around them, the playground bustled with activity, children laughing, parents helping, a community coming together. But in that moment, their family stood in perfect stillness, wrapped in the warm sunlight of truth, faith, and love. The bracelet that had once symbolized loss now rested quietly in Caleb's hand, a reminder not of what was missing, but of everything they had found. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here, again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.